we'll do the live thing first. Like, hey everybody, welcome back to the Bigmark podcast. It's me, your host, Bigmark. I'm here again with you. Just me and you. Welcome back. If you've never been here before, welcome. This is the Bigmark podcast. You know, we chat from everything from sports to psychedelics. And, you know, we have a few ways to follow the podcast. If you want to check us out on Twitter or Instagram at the Bigmark Pod or at the Bigmark Podcast, respectively. You can support the podcast by checking us out at the Patreon, patreon.com/thebigmarkpod. Yeah, it's many ways to join in. If you join on the Patreon, you can kind of let us know what you like. You can, join in a little bit in our Bigmark podcast community, and let us know what you want to hear about, and suggest guests. And we have behind the scenes things and other exclusives all on there for you. But yeah, so today, as we like to get into it, I'm gonna get into actually a really cool topic suggested by my boy P Diz. Shout out P Diz. We're talking about John Lilly today. And he is kind of really well known in the psychedelic psychonaut community. And, he was involved with a lot of stuff, like a lot of really interesting stuff and a lot of really out there stuff too. So, one of the things, he's one of the pioneers of float tank research, and what we're going to get into mostly today is some of his research with dolphins. Actually, really, really interesting. So in the summer of 1965, in a multi-story house, John C Lilly prepared for his most ambitious project to date, and him and several other researchers, including Margaret Howe, flooded that house to allow dolphins to swim inside with the researchers. They called it the Dolphin Point Laboratory. They were actually trying to teach dolphins to speak and understand English, essentially breaking the interspecies language barrier. So dolphins obviously being highly intelligent, and we have observed them clearly communicating with themselves. Many researchers have tried to attempt to kind of decipher or try and understand their language, and obviously, no one's ever really been able to. And so John C Lilly, his experiment was actually funded by NASA and the U.S. military. So really interesting to think that, again, the people involved, it wasn't just a willy-nilly experiment. And there has been history of the Navy, trying to use marine animals. They have a marine animal project that they've tried to train animals to actually, do military projects, whatever you'd like to say. They get out there, whether they're dropping bombs off or, detecting landmines, things like that. Really interesting stuff. So for the experiment, they had a few different dolphins to choose from. Some of the dolphins were a little bit kind of just not really outgoing enough, and they didn't know if they should go with a female or a male. They ended up choosing a young dolphin named Peter, and it was this 10-week experiment, again, to try and teach him how to speak and understand English. The goal was to try and, get Peter, and the other two dolphins were more or less involved in the experiment as well. They focused mostly on Peter to try and get him to at least say a word that he understood what it meant in context, to officially say, like, hey, like, it understands English. So a little bit more about John C Lilly, because he's the overseer of this project. He worked with the National Institute of Health for a while. He was actually a neurophysiologist. and he mapped the neural regions that trigger pain, fear, and arousal in macaque monkeys. So he was responsible for essentially trying to map these brain regions. And like I've mentioned before, one of the hardest things with understanding the brain in any type of primate, human or otherwise, is it's very, very hard to decipher some of the regions in the brain, because in a textbook you see the brain in the diagram, and it's like, oh yeah, you can see each little structure there, but when you're looking at an actual brain, it's really, really difficult to decipher each region. And of course, we understand that different regions, now we understand that different regions do affect the way you behave, and we can pretty much pinpoint those regions thanks to the work by scientists like John C Lilly. So he demonstrated that if a macaque monkey is given a switch to stimulate an electrode placed in the pleasure center of the brain, which is also called the nucleus accumbens, it would press the switch 3 times a second for 16 hours a day. So essentially, if monkeys, and we like to, in psychology, like to basically compare human behavior and monkey behavior, because our brain structures are very similar, that if we were given a switch that could stimulate the pleasure center of our brain, we would hit that thing as much as we could from dawn till dusk, essentially. His early work with dolphins actually John C. Lilly's early work with dolphins actually led to some dolphin deaths by asphyxiating them while under anesthesia. So when he was studying, obviously he was studying monkeys, and amongst other animals, he was also studying dolphins. He would give them anesthesia to be able to study their actual brains, while obviously not killing them, and them not feeling pain during the procedure. However, because when he unfortunately killed some of these dolphins, putting them under anesthesia, he discovered that the dolphins don't breathe unconsciously. So they're not, right now that I'm saying this, you're probably thinking in your head, whether you're watching this or listening, oh, now I'm breathing. We have that kind of switch in our body where it does go from autonomic to a conscious kind of thing with breathing. So that's the thing, is that evidently dolphins don't have this, which sadly come up later. Anyway, the reason why Lilly actually went with dolphins, again, like I said, their overall size, they're not too big. There's other intelligent mammals like orcas and stuff, but they're just too large to deal with. Their brain size is actually very similar to humans. They actually potentially have a larger prefrontal cortex, or at least a slightly different shaped brain, but about the same size to humans, as well as their complex behaviors. So again, they clearly are talking, are communicating with each other, and they have some intelligence. And there's been, Lilly, in his research, he spoke with a lot of whalers and fishermen and people that see these animals in the wild, and they do many coordinated behaviors and attacks, and it's fascinating. So one of the other things is Lilly actually found that some bottlenose dolphins were actually able to mimic human speech. So mimic obviously is a general term. Obviously they don't really speak through their mouths, but they are able to kind of speak through their blowhole, which allows them to vocalize. They obviously are able to vocalize with their kind of nasal cavities, and that's how they actually communicate, and they use frequencies that actually humans aren't able to produce or anything like that. But the dolphins, and actually some other like similar animals, marine mammals, are able to mimic human speech. Nosy, which was actually a beluga whale on the west coast, could actually mimic human speech. It was found like saving some divers from something. Anyway, something happened where this beluga whale was actually able to say like was actually vocalizing in a way that the divers thought it was another human yelling at them to do something. Fascinating. I couldn't find the details of the story. I read it like in a meme somewhere once, but there's lots of evidence of this no-see beluga, and he was actually captured and lived in captivity. But belugas are actually also known as canaries of the sea. So, you know, they are able to do these vocalizations, which may enable them to speak or again mimic the human voice if they've heard it somehow before. Lilly was more on the periphery of this actual dolphin experiment that actually went down. He actually, because of his use of the sensory deprivation tank, he saw the tank as a doorway to the universe, and he felt that he could contribute to the experiment telepathically. So separate sensory deprivation tanks. I think Zach Angus and I probably talked about this once because him and I did a sensory deprivation tank. If I've never mentioned before, if you've never heard of it, it's this pod or in some cases a room essentially where there's only about 2 feet of highly salted water, lots of Epsom salts in the water. So when you lay in the water, your body floats. It's the same temperature. The water's the same temperature as your body. And it's completely dark. You can't hear anything if your ears are under the water, or if you've plugged your ears if you don't want the water to get in, and you can't see anything. So again, most of your senses are completely deprived. And a lot of researchers, a lot of people, your Joe Rogans, including John C Lilly, also think that it's just a way to accelerate meditation. And again, John C. Reilly saw the tank as a doorway to the universe. And when he used it, he would actually be contacted by 3 entities that he called the ECCO, or the Earth Coincidence Control Office. So he was actually he felt that he was being contacted by these entities, which is fascinating. And they convinced him at one point to actually leave his job and his wife and throw himself into the dolphin study. So again, he really took these entities for what they were saying, and it's fascinating. I mean, there's other drugs and other psychedelic experiences, as I've mentioned before, where you feel like you're possibly in contact with entities or some kind of other being. But to then take that advice and really, really put it into your life, I mean, that's a really interesting scenario. Lilly studied the dolphin language, as he called Dolphinese, which, again, so this is kind of before the major study in the flooded house, when he was kind of just doing some preliminary work. In studying this Dolphinese, he discovered that dolphins can whistle through one nostril and click with the other, and have 2 distinct conversations with each one too, which would basically be like speaking in one language while also signing, like using sign language, and having a completely separate conversation at the same time, which is like obviously takes serious higher cognitive coordination for sure. So again, before the experiment, early in 1964, despite having no scientific background, when Lilly was actually recruiting people to help him out with this experiment, despite having no scientific background, Margaret Howe volunteered at Lilly's clinic. He believed this coincidence to be a cosmic one orchestrated by the ECCO. So, I mean, this woman coming out of nowhere, no scientific background, like just diving into, again, this is going to be a 10-week program or a 10-week project, experiment where you're going to be right in there. I don't think she necessarily had any previous experience with animals either, let alone marine animals. And anyway, so she was to be living there with the dolphins as well, doing these experiments, trying to teach Peter how to speak English. So anyway, Margaret believed that Peter was making progress with the English when she was working with him early, at least in the early going. It was obviously dolphins can't vocalize like we do. They don't have lips, so they're not going to be able to actually like say different words. So what Peter, the dolphin's issues were consonants, of course. He actually, when he was trying to say Margaret, because she'd always try to get him to say, hello, Margaret, hello, Margaret. He had to kind of roll slightly underwater to say the M sound, or for him to kind of vocalize a sound that sounded like M in this case. Other thing too, which was like, this basically became the hook, let's say, to the whole experiment. During this whole experiment, Peter was also going through puberty. Again, they chose a younger dolphin, but they didn't really think ahead, and it's because he was male as well. He was going through puberty. So as we know, any animal going through puberty is going to be having certain feelings and certain sensations. Peter would routinely get an erection. He'd get a boner during the lesson, and he'd ruin it. Obviously, any misplaced boner is going to ruin any situation. So, it wasn't asked for. There was no consent on the boner. So I'm just joking. He'd be too distracted. And again, just Margaret would have to move on with the lesson or go away while Peter calmed down, I guess. And obviously this was disrupting the experiments, and, it was slowing things down, and, people were, or at least the experimenters just weren't happy with the process. So Margaret decided that she should jerk Peter off, essentially. So she would masturbate Peter, she'd jerk him off, and she said he would come to some type of climax. She said she'd use her hands or her feet, and she just saw it as a way for the experiment to keep moving on. I mean, obviously strange, and we're talking about crossing ethical lines here, but again, I think her non-scientific background and just potential inexperience or over-enthusiasm for the experiment may have led to this. It's an interesting thing. But she fully admits that she started to become a little bit more relaxed with their sexual relationship too, and it wasn't necessarily so much so just for the experiment to move on as things continued on. I mean, there's some people think that movie The Shape of Water is kind of along the lines of this, because I mean, if there is an emotional intelligence there, obviously, as we all know, and language is only goes so far as far as like English, as far as the actual, the type of speech you're using only goes so far. Communication is so much more nonverbal. There's so much more to this. And listen, don't get me wrong, we don't have to go too deep into this, but that people have different relationships with different, with different people, and there's something there where, you love them for something more than just what they say, and you can communicate in that way. And hey, maybe somehow Margaret and Peter felt that, and there was some type of communication there. Who knows? If this animal is that intelligent, maybe it is able to somehow communicate, and there was some type of connection there, which, man, it's super deep. I mean, of course it's going against all convention and everything, and it's many levels of gross. But if you kind of want to suspend belief and just kind of nurture this idea for a second, I guess it can be beautiful in a way. Fascinating. So obviously people hearing about this, people, the powers that be that are funding this, essentially the U.S. military and NASA saw that the effort to communicate with dolphins is comparable to the task that would face them when they find extraterrestrials. So actually, that was something that Carl Sagan said, that he thinks because at the time they were searching and potentially continuing to search for extraterrestrial life, and as this podcast is coming out now, the world governments are starting to release the fact that UFOs are real and something's here, whether they're extraterrestrials or not. There's these UFOs are flying around our Earth that the militaries of our world are frigging encountering all the time. Tremendous. But again, really interesting thought. I was kind of thinking when I was doing this research, what the hell does NASA have to do with any of this stuff? But if they're actually trying to contact extraterrestrials, that could be one of the hardest things about the whole process, is that, yeah, maybe we might find these aliens out there somewhere, but how the hell are we supposed to communicate with them? We can't just start speaking English to them. That's what kind of drew NASA into this whole thing. And again, this is a big buildup, but before the experiment started, this is years before, Lilly actually met with Frank Drake, who actually came up with the Drake equation, which is basically an equation for the odds of finding another intelligent race out there that can communicate with us. Anyway, Lilly met with Frank Drake and many other scientists who specialize in extraterrestrial communication. That included Carl Sagan, among others. And Sagan, Lilly, and Drake actually got together. And, Lilly was brought to this whole scientific affair because of his work with dolphins, because of all this language that he's trying to determine and trying to figure out the dolphinese and doing all that stuff. Again, this is pre trying to teach dolphins how to speak it there at that point. Lilly was still trying to just understand their language. So Carl Sagan, Lilly, and Drake actually got together and created a group, just the three of them, called the Order of the Dolphins, and they used to wear these dolphin pins, and they truly believe that the entire NASA program hinged on, I shouldn't say NASA program, but the scientists along with Drake that got together, that whole program hinged on Lilly's studies. However, the problem was Lilly's studies kept coming up short in proving that the dolphins were learning to speak or understand English. Obviously, when Lilly was doing these studies before, and he was trying to understand the dolphinese, he was realizing that the dolphins' vocalizations, some of them are so high-pitched that humans could never recreate their language. So basically what he decided in the experiment, that's why he decided to try and actually teach them English, because it couldn't work the other way around. So again, once the main experiment started happening with trying to teach the dolphins how to speak and understand English, they weren't panning out quite, as expected. I mean, kind of as expected, it wasn't panning out. Lilly started giving dolphins so Lilly kind of started going off script, and he started giving the dolphins LSD. So Sissy and Pam were the other dolphins that I mentioned before, the two female dolphins that were a little bit more introverted, and Pam, who was normally quiet, became much more extroverted, and she was playing around when she was given this dose of acid, and Lilly was able to observe that. So he thought he'd give it to Peter, but Peter was already kind of, happy-go-lucky, young, energetic, extroverted dolphin. It had the acid had a complete opposite effect on Peter. He just kind of was more of an internal event, if you will. So, obviously with Margaret living there and other researchers coming in and out, it became an issue with the researchers, and basically led to the project being ended prematurely. And again, things did kind of totally surround that relationship potentially that happened with Margaret and Peter. One of the other researchers said that he would sexually relieve one of the female dolphins too. And again, this is, you're becoming so close with these creatures. Who knows what's happening here? Again, stuff is starting to just, go wild here. But because of this kind of relationship between Peter and Margaret, and it just was happening over 10 weeks, Peter was essentially in love with Margaret. Because the project ended prematurely, Peter actually committed suicide by stopping breathing. Like I said, dolphins don't have conscious control of their breathing. And he just stopped his breathing and refused to surface and just died. Which, of course, really sad ending kind of to that whole dolphin experiment. I mean, again, ethical boundaries. Since then, that experiment has been cited many times to make sure when you're using animal subjects, if you're even allowed to use animal subjects. Usually it's only just mice right now that you're allowed to actually study. You can't really even do like primate or monkey studies, but it's it just kind of turned the tide in a better way too, right? Because we don't want to see abuse of animals, and this was too far. I mean, it was abuse of animals, it was abuse of people. This is just when things start to kind of get crossed, and then all of a sudden we start introducing psychedelics to these animals, and they're starting to have all these side effects and things like that. It just starts to get really messy. Again, with Lilly starting to give LSD to the animals, Lilly's just starting to kind of go on his own journey here. He used to use LSD while he was in the tanks, but they started to outlaw LSD, so you couldn't really get LSD for scientific study anymore. So Lilly turned to using ketamine, which is a type of dissociative tranquilizer, dissociative anesthetic that in certain doses has given the user kind of a feeling of dissociation and feeling outside their body or disconnected from their body. It's been used in a lot of therapy sessions as of late. A lot more studies being done on ketamine these days, and again, there's ketamine clinics, and it's been used in really healthy ways lately. But back in the day, ketamine was kind of early being studied. It wasn't a well-known drug. This was, again, something maybe thought of as an LSD alternative, or at least to Lilly, this is something that he wanted to start to actually explore, and I guess he could get his hands on it, and I guess it wasn't outlawed at the time. So while the study, the dolphin study, kind of was a bust, Lilly did become a counterculture star. Like I mentioned before, his writings, started to become popular. But as things kind of were developing in his own psyche, and the more ketamine he was using, his writing started to become a little bit more opaque and a little bit more harder to understand. At one point, he believed that the ECCO had taken his penis away from him. I'll go into that story a little bit later, but essentially Lilly himself believed the ECCO wanted him to stop using ketamine eventually and get back to his dolphin studies. Lilly went on to start the Janus Project, which is actually a project to try and develop a common language. So instead of trying to teach the dolphins English or them try to learn Dolphinese, they tried to develop a language that was kind of a hybrid between the two, and again, try and develop somewhat of a Rosetta Stone between humans and dolphins, and again, just try their best to do this, to breach this interspecies gap, because again, to Lilly, it seemed like he was driven by the ECCO, which you can say, who knows exactly what that is, his inner psyche, potentially a manifestation of it, or whatever it is. He was driven by the fact that he wanted to try to intercommunicate with other species, which could be fascinating. I mean, we've all tried to, and, in many ways, when we do communicate with animals, we could just be anthropomorphizing many of the things. We could just be kind of imagining this is what they think and giving them much more complicated thoughts because that's how we think. And we're just kind of projecting that onto the animal a little bit. But I mean, who knows really at the end of the day. Although this project is famously a failure, Lilly's public persona, still kind of remains, his sensory deprivation tank studies have become popularized by the movie Altered States. Joe Rogan talks about him all the time because he came up with these sensory deprivation tanks. And the tanks are cool, man. Like you can get some really cool stuff done in there. It really helps you with meditation. It really helps, in kind of all different ways. But, maybe when they kind of open back up a little bit, if they're open back up, maybe I'll go do one, and then, we can chat a little bit about it. But again, it's interesting with all these figures in history where they've been accused of or have done heinous things, and however they've also discovered amazing things. And it's hard to kind of discount some of these amazing discoveries, even though they've been involved in other kind of questionable things, at best. So other researchers actually believe that Lilly was onto something by trying to communicate with them telepathically. So other researchers kind of took up from where Lilly went and tried to continue to communicate telepathically with these animals. While Lilly kind of left the animal studies behind, and he continued his own experiments with ketamine. Him and actually a research Dr. Craig Enright worked with kind of subsequent doses of ketamine while in a sensory deprivation tank, and cured Lilly of his migraines. So Lilly had chronic migraines before this. This is we're now into the 70s here. This is after the dolphin studies. Enright and Lilly are working together in the sensory deprivation tank, and Enright would inject Lilly with increasingly larger doses of ketamine. And basically what Lilly, so they'd inject him with Enright would inject Lilly with the ketamine, and then Lilly would get into the sensory deprivation tank. And he said while he was in there, he could physically feel his migraine coming out of his body, and it came out about 2 inches and then went back in, and it was searing pain, just like his normal migraine pain, brutal. He asked for more ketamine, and the increased dose made the migraine come out again, but a little bit further, maybe 6 inches further. And then he ended up getting into about 120 microgram, or a large dose, whatever the unit of dosages they were using, a large dose of ketamine. And he said that ball, whatever that migraine, that he called it his migraine that came out of his head, went over the horizon and never came back. And a month later, he still never had migraines, and for the rest of his life, he continued to never suffer from migraines again. So he believed that it cured his migraine. Dr. Enright himself actually injected himself with K, and a lot of the experiments that Enright and Lilly were doing were talking about pre-programming the brain. So essentially it was this cueing, and you're just setting up your mind for different thought patterns. before you even go into the float tank with the ketamine. So kind of unbeknownst to Lilly apparently, but according to this story that I read, Enright actually pre-programmed his brain to like go back to like the pre-hominid, like archetypal, like early man aspect of the human psyche. So he reprogrammed his mind back to its pre-hominid origins of man. So he came out of the tank. Lilly released him from the tank, and he was acting like an ape man, you know, running around, flailing his arms, acting like a monkey, and, you know, making noises. And essentially Lilly thought that Enright was having a seizure. You know, he didn't think he was acting like a monkey or anything. He just thought he was freaking out. But it turned out that each one was actually experiencing a separate reality at the same time. So while Lilly thought that his buddy Enright was having a seizure and freaking out, Enright claimed to be this ape-like character having an encounter with a leopard. And at one point he actually climbed a tree to get away. So I guess he saw Lilly as the leopard potentially, but essentially what the researchers took from this is that Enright and Lilly drew three important conclusions. First, one's internal reality could differ radically from the external reality in which one was participating, even with regard to prominent features of the physical environment. So again, like I said, you know, Enright thought he climbed a tree. That Lilly, obviously, they're in a scientific lab. There's no trees in there. Second, the person might remain active physically in the environment in a manner not responding closely to one's internal experience of this activity. So essentially, the person might the person who thinks that they're in this separate reality is going to respond to that reality accordingly. They're not going to respond to things any differently. We can't predict at all what reality they're seeing either, too. So as they act, they're only going to respond to what they have in their internal experience. The third thing that they figured out is one could remain totally oblivious to this disparity. So clearly they don't have any idea that their reality is any different from whatever any other person that's in there, whatever their reality may be. You know, obviously when we're with each other, we have a general idea of we're in this reality together, right? Unless we're taking psychedelics together. But, you know what I'm saying? So, you know, given these conditions, Lilly and Enright agreed that it would be a good idea at all times to have a safety man. So obviously they're both kind of trained physiologists. So it was good that one of them would just be there completely sober, there to make sure everyone was okay coming in and out of these experiments. As things went on, obviously Lilly continued to continue experimenting with ketamine, and one of his biggest determining factors was ketamine's measurability. So essentially, unlike any other programming agents, as Lilly liked to call them, or any other psychedelic drugs he had used in the past, ketamine's effects were extremely predictable. So essentially, you can determine exacting levels of dosage to correspond with the desired effect one wished to experience. So essentially, you knew exactly what you were going to expect, but from the dosage. Whereas other psychedelics, like we've potentially mentioned other psychedelics on this podcast before, we potentially, some of those have a lot more, like whether it's acid, LSD, whether it's mushrooms, a lot of these have a little bit more unpredictability depending on dose, depending on which mushroom you're using, depending on the batch of LSD. You know, they can be a little bit more harder to predict. So, again, as I mentioned before, there could be a possible correlation between ketamine and DMT, where each of these drugs administered at certain exacting dosages, apparently summoned forth extraterrestrial or other dimensional entities. Now, that's not to say, other high doses of psilocybin, have affected the response in some users. Terrence McKenna has said that he's communicated telepathically with alien intelligences under the mushrooms' powers, if you will. But again, psilocybin's effects are hard to measure, and they can be so different, and they have kind of other peripheral effects that might affect the experiment. Perhaps that's why the measurability and the predictability of K also appealed to Dr. Lilly. In this manner, the scientific method could be followed to achieve the desired mind-bending effects. So, he knew exactly what dosage he was using with the ketamine, and he could go from there. Unfortunately, in later experiments, Lilly failed to heed his own advice, and he would do his experiments without a safety man. And one time he injected himself with a dosage of ketamine and climbed into his hot tub. Unfortunately, the hot tub was too hot, but when Lilly went to go to get out, his muscles weren't working, whether it was that hot or whether it was the effects of the ketamine started kicking in. He just collapsed back into the bubbles, and Lilly was totally conscious at this point, but due to the effects of the ketamine, he was unaware of the external reality of his own drowning body. So he was just kind of dissociated from the fact that he was even drowning. And, so obviously the reality of the fact that he was face down, and he was only conscious of his internal world. As fate would have it, a friend of his somehow, for some reason, was driven by a sudden sense of urgency, decided at this time to call Dr. Lilly. Dr. Lilly's wife answered the phone and was like, he's in his tank, he's okay. And, Dr. Lilly's friend was insistent, and he said, you have to go get John. I need to talk to him. I'm compelled to talk to him. And that's when Tony found him, and she revived him using mouth to mouth. And, essentially, with this brush with death, only reaffirmed Lilly's deep conviction that his life was being watched over by the higher powers of the ECCO that I mentioned before. So the ECCO, again, being the Earth Coincidence Control Office, he thinks all these things that are seemingly coincidental are actually being controlled by these higher extraterrestrial beings that have galactic control, and there's different hierarchies of that as well, which the different other coincidence control offices, I guess. And again, this is stuff that Lilly discovered during his ketamine experiments. However, like I mentioned before, there was I said the ECCO took John Lilly's penis. So essentially, John Lilly assumed that the ECCO wasn't there just to protect him, but to also test him in some way, and that whole thing was a test. So essentially, after a large shot of ketamine, John Lilly thought that he was, taken by the ECCO control officers. They removed his penis and just handed it back to him, completely bloodlessly, just removed it. And he started freaking out. His wife comes in and goes, John, you still have a penis? And again, this is just, we're talking about a little bit of a descent here, right? So he still bounced back and realized that his penis was totally fine. And that really didn't deter his ketamine use. He actually started increasing his use. He actually was up to an hour and one injection per hour a day. So he was doing as many hours as he was awake. He was doing an injection of this ketamine. During this point, he began having contact with another alien intelligence agency, which he called the SSI, which is short for Solid State Intelligence. And Solid State Intelligence was like a supercomputer-like entity kind of like the Borg, I'm assuming, or like some type of, it says in this article I read here, same vein as Philip K. Dick's Valis, but the problem with SSI is that they're malevolent in nature and at odds with the ECCO. And SSI's apparent goal is to conquer and dominate all biological life forms on Earth, which is kind of fascinating because I won't delve too far into this, but when I was reading about this, I thought it was fascinating because, I mean, I've heard this thought before. I can't remember exactly where, but that essentially that there is this kind of battle between nature and technology that's happening potentially right in front of our eyes or without us necessarily knowing, where, you know, there's always this push to trying to get back to nature while simultaneously this push to continue to grow and continue to make new things and build new things and tear down. And, you know, like, I think it was actually Philip K. Dick who said that we are, or I can't remember who said this, but anyway, that we are the reproductive organ of the machine world, so that somehow we are, with all this technology and we're constantly trying new things and trying to make new things, that is feeding into that side of the world or reality. Or anyway, super interesting. But again, Lilly was really starting to get into this stuff, and while all this stuff was happening, Lilly was still being contacted by the ECCO, and the ECCO essentially made it clear to Lilly that he was being enlisted in this archetypal battle between good and evil. Again, you know, with a lot of psychedelics, it brings forth a lot of archetypal thoughts, and a lot of these thoughts are kind of deeply embedded in our nature that we don't even think about. And, you know, once you start to lose kind of grip with this reality, you know, your mind can go anywhere, and Lilly sure was. However, you know, with all this stuff going on, Lilly being a scientist was always kind of looking for proof of this stuff. And at one point, Lilly was actually given a sign. In the autumn of 1974, he was flying into Los Angeles International Airport with his wife, and while in the air, Dr. Lilly saw the comet Kahutek out of the southern sky. Momentarily, the comet grew brighter, and at this point, a message was laser beamed into Lilly's mind, which said, "We are solid state intelligence, and we are going to demonstrate our power by shutting down all solid state equipment to LAX." So he was feeling this right there. I mean, this was him in the plane. It wasn't him during an experiment. This was something that was just coming to him in his life. And of course, he's in the plane with his wife, and he tells her, she's sitting next to him, and he says what happened. And a few minutes later, the pilot instructed the passengers that they were being diverted to Burbank due to a plane that landed near the runway, and had knocked down the power lines, causing a power failure to the airport. So take that as you will. Lilly maybe saw that as a sign, and it's like, oh man, like, super trippy. After 3 weeks of these hourly ketamine injections, Lilly decided that he would travel to the East Coast to warn the political leaders and member of the media of the threat posed by the solid state intelligence. So he was really buying into this stuff. He felt like he needed to take it on himself to go and tell people, the powers that be. He actually phoned the White House to warn President Gerald Ford. A White House aide actually fielded the call, and he knew Dr. Lilly's impressive credentials and everything, and he just didn't buy it. He let Lilly kind of talk himself out and informed him the president was unavailable. So while this was as this was all going on, obviously the people around John Lilly are pretty concerned with his behavior. Some of his ideas are a little out there. And one of his interns actually, he really believed that Lilly had finally lost it, and he tried to commit Lilly to a psychiatric hospital. And in Lilly's mind, the ECCO intervened again because one of Lilly's friends actually was the director of the hospital. And as soon as he got in there, he saw Lilly and was like, "Man, you don't belong here. Get out." So to Lilly, this coincidence control office came in again. It's like, man, all these coincidences are happening. How can all this be the same? How can this not be driven and orchestrated by this higher power? So, he's seeing to Lilly, all his ideas are being confirmed. He's just feeling like he's on the ball. Still following the lead of the ECCO, Dr. Lee continued his ever-escalating injections of ketamine in order to remain in contact with his space brothers. So soon, because he was using so much ketamine, his sources started to dry up. So all the guys that were getting him the ketamine started to kind of, cut him off because they kind of thought he was going too far. Like I mentioned, even at one point, like I mentioned before, the ECCO in Lilly's mind thought that he was being taken over by the K, that it was that he was going to be unable to kind of do their bidding because he was getting a little bit too addicted to it. So whether in Lilly's mind the ECCO was organizing the dealers kind of cutting him off, or whether that just convinced him otherwise, Lilly started to trying to find another drug that was going to replace the K, just kind of like he did with the LSD. He was trying to find a new drug that was going to give him the same effects as ketamine, but a much longer duration. So he found a drug that could do this. And during one of his first experiments with it, his wife actually called him to drop off a set of keys that she forgot at home or something like that. So, nothing was happening yet in the experiment. John thought he was going to be okay. And, he's had such an experience with all these psychedelic drugs up until this point. He thought he could just hop on his bike and go help her. So midway through the ride, nothing was happening yet, until all of a sudden he was completely zapped by an intoxicating magic, as he would say. And he said it was wonderful and euphoric until the chain snapped on his bike and he went flying, broke several ribs, punctured a lung. And the bicycle crash essentially resulted in several days of hospitalization, where Dr. Lilly was once again visited by otherworldly representations of the ECCO, who essentially told him he had a choice. He could go with them for good. He could go away with them for good, or remain on the planet, mend his body, and concentrate on more worldly affairs. Obviously, Lilly chose the latter. He came back. With the decision, it was a turning point in his life and a conscious effort to focus on the remaining years, not only on more earthly matters. So he was the remaining years of his life, he wanted to focus on, his wife and, what's happening here instead of everything he did, and just doing the whims and wishes of the ECCO. He wanted to dedicate the rest of his life, through physical time and space, as he says. Many paranormal parallels can be drawn from the experience of John Lilly. One such being the so-called near-death experience. So in near-death experience, where guides, as he calls them, the two representatives of the ECCO, appeared to Lilly much as figurative angels bathed in light do to others who have experienced near-death experiences. So other people, car crashes and things like that, they see angels coming to them. They see other entities. Often they seem they are seemingly near dead, hovering before a subjective light. They are offered a choice much similar to the one given Dr. Lilly by his otherworldly benefactors. Should I stay or should I go? Do you want to come with us? Do you want to stay here? So essentially, basically what Lilly could have been doing is he could have been almost killing himself with this ketamine all the time. And he was just starting to have these experiences because he was essentially near death. So, to kind of wrap this up a little bit, this story here kind of opens up more questions and more possibilities and other things that maybe we can go into in the future. But there was something really interesting that John Lilly said, and it was something about insanity versus outsanity. Insanity, obviously, everything that exists in your head, all those kind of maybe darker thoughts, or just those thoughts that you kind of keep to yourself. And outsanity, in his definition, was what we bring and what we tell each other and how we talk. And most of the time we don't bring the insanity to the outsanity. And in our society, the insanity, we don't want to see that as much. So the people who let that out, we kind of consider them to be strange or even harmful to themselves or society. And John Lilly really believed that he brought too much of his insanity out, and it could be totally true. And it speaks to obviously the responsible use of psychedelics, and knowing that once you, like one of my favorite quotes by Alan Watts, once you get the message, hang up the phone. You don't have to keep going down that same road all the time. Chronic use is one thing that potentially isn't going to give you the results that it might. I mean, experimental conditions and everything that, it obviously calls for chronic usages, at least for short durations. But again, even these experiments, they should be a warning to people as or not necessarily a warning, but again, even in scientific circumstances, things can kind of get out of hand and researchers can kind of go wild. But we got to use them as a learning tool as well. They've taken things to the brink, and we got to use their lessons and know that this reality is only what we make it, and our senses can only tell so much about this reality. And this whole story, it talks about the extremes of things, but float tanks, little psychedelic stuff like this, dolphins here and there, it's all a little bit of good things here and there, in moderation. But obviously not to take away the seriousness of some of these stories. You got to be careful out there, like we always mention. Responsible psychedelic use is really important, and we want everyone to be safe out there. But yeah, check out this story. There's a bunch of documentaries and articles on this out there. But if you like what you heard, we want to hear from you. Leave a comment down on YouTube if you're watching. Rate the podcast if you can. Tell your friends about it. If you want to support the podcast, check out the Bigmark podcast on Twitter and Instagram, and you can support us at our Patreon at patreon.com/thebigmarkpodcast. Again, we love you. We want you to go out there and explore the world, inner and outer, and do it in a safe way, because life's just a ride. You can get on, you can get off, but just remember, it's just a ride. We love you. Have a good one. Cheers.